Welcome to a quiet evening journey through time, where the crackling warmth of an imaginary fireplace accompanies us as we explore the fascinating worlds of ancient Mexico and Greece. Tonight, we venture into civilizations so different from our own that understanding them requires us to completely reimagine what daily life could be like. The gentle flames beside us cast dancing shadows that seem to flicker with the memories of countless generations who lived, loved, worked, and dreamed in worlds that operated according to entirely different principles than our modern existence. Picture yourself settling into a comfortable chair beside a stone hearth, the gentle flames casting dancing shadows on weathered walls that have absorbed the stories of ages past. The fire whispers softly as we begin our exploration of two remarkable ancient worlds that flourished thousands of years apart, yet shared surprising similarities in their complexity, sophistication, and profound understanding of human nature. The warmth radiating from the glowing logs creates an atmosphere of perfect contemplation, allowing our minds to wander freely across the vast expanses of time that separate us from these extraordinary civilizations. The ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica emerged in a landscape of incredible diversity that challenged human ingenuity at every turn. From the humid lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula, where tropical rains created lush jungles filled with exotic birds and mysterious shadows, to the high plateaus of central Mexico, where thin air and dramatic temperature variations tested human endurance, various cultures developed sophisticated societies that would challenge any modern person's ability to adapt. The Maya, Aztec, Olmec, Zapotec, Mixtec, and countless other groups created intricate networks of cities, agricultural systems, and social structures that operated according to principles vastly different from our contemporary understanding of civilization. These ancient Mexican territories stretched across a geographical canvas that included steaming rainforests where howler monkeys announced the dawn, arid deserts where survival required intimate knowledge of rare water sources, temperate highlands where morning frosts gave way to blazing afternoon sun, and coastal regions where the rhythm of waves provided a constant backdrop to human activity. Each environment demanded specific adaptations in housing, clothing, food production, and social organization that modern people, accustomed to climate-controlled spaces and standardized living conditions, would find impossibly complex and demanding. In these ancient Mexican territories, the rhythm of life followed cosmic patterns that modern people have largely forgotten in their pursuit of artificial schedules and mechanical timekeeping. The calendar systems were so intricate and sophisticated that priests spent decades learning to calculate the interactions between multiple simultaneous cycles that tracked everything from Venus transit patterns to rainfall probabilities. Time itself was understood as circular rather than linear, with each day carrying specific spiritual significance that influenced everything from agricultural decisions and the timing of ceremonies to the naming of children and the scheduling of marriages. The mathematical precision required to maintain these calendar systems was staggering, involving calculations that coordinated lunar cycles, solar years, planetary movements, and seasonal variations in ways that modern astronomers appreciate for their accuracy and sophistication. The priests who mastered these systems were essentially scientists, astronomers, mathematicians, and spiritual guides combined into single individuals who carried the responsibility for maintaining the cosmic order that governed community life. The geography that shaped these civilizations was both generous and demanding, offering abundant natural resources while requiring constant adaptation to environmental challenges that could shift dramatically across relatively short distances. The Valley of Mexico, where the great city of Tenochtitlan would eventually rise like a jewel set in the midst of shimmering waters, was originally a series of interconnected lakes surrounded by volcanic peaks whose snow-capped summits provided a constant reminder of the powerful geological forces that shaped the landscape. These lakes were not simply bodies of water but complex ecosystems that supported millions of migratory birds, provided fish and aquatic plants for human consumption, and offered transportation routes that connected distant communities. The management of these water resources required sophisticated engineering skills that included the construction of dikes, canals, drainage systems, and the famous floating gardens that allowed intensive agriculture in areas that might otherwise have been unusable for food production. The Aztecs, arriving in this region in the 13th century after a long migration from northern territories, found a landscape already shaped by centuries of human habitation and modification. Previous civilizations had built pyramids, established trade networks, developed agricultural techniques, and created artistic traditions that the Aztecs absorbed, modified, and expanded according to their own cultural vision and practical needs. Meanwhile, across the vast Atlantic Ocean, ancient Greece was developing in a completely different geographical context that nevertheless produced civilizations of comparable sophistication and cultural achievement. The rocky peninsulas and scattered islands of the Aegean Sea created isolated communities that nonetheless maintained extensive trade networks connecting them to distant lands and exotic cultures. The mountains that divided Greek territories into separate city-states also provided marble for temples whose architectural perfection still inspires awe. While the surrounding seas offered fish for sustenance and shipping routes that facilitated communication with distant lands. The Mediterranean climate that characterized most Greek territories created a seasonal rhythm that alternated between wet winters when most agricultural work was accomplished and dry summers when outdoor activities could be pursued with minimal concern about weather disruptions. This predictable pattern allowed Greeks to develop cultural institutions like athletic competitions, theatrical festivals, and philosophical gatherings that required advanced planning and community coordination across multiple city-states. Greek civilization, like its Mexican counterparts thousands of miles away, emerged from earlier cultures that had already developed complex societies with sophisticated technologies, artistic traditions, and social institutions. The Minoans of Crete had established elaborate palace complexes with advanced plumbing systems, artistic workshops, and administrative bureaucracies that managed extensive trading relationships throughout the Mediterranean region. The Mycenaeans of mainland Greece had built massive fortress cities, developed linear writing systems, and maintained military organizations capable of long-distance expeditions. The physical demands of life in ancient Greece were immense and would overwhelm most contemporary people within days of arrival. Citizens walked everywhere on foot, traveling rocky paths between cities that could be dozens of miles apart across mountainous terrain that tested endurance and navigation skills. The diet consisted primarily of bread made from various grains, olives processed into oil for cooking and preservation, wine diluted with water for safe drinking, and occasionally fish or meat when available. With most people experiencing seasonal variations in food availability that would seem extreme and potentially dangerous by modern nutritional standards. Physical fitness was not optional but essential for survival in a world where manual labor, walking long distances, and adapting to environmental challenges were daily requirements. The gymnasium culture that developed in Greek cities was not simply recreational but practical training for the physical demands of life in a world without mechanical assistance for most tasks. In ancient Mexico, the physical challenges were equally demanding but manifested differently according to the specific environmental conditions of different regions. The high altitude of many settlements meant that visitors from sea level would struggle with the thin air that left them gasping during any physical exertion. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan sat at over 7,000 feet above sea level, a height that would leave modern travelers feeling dizzy and exhausted until their bodies adapted to the reduced oxygen levels. The tropical regions presented different challenges, including intense heat, high humidity, dangerous animals, and diseases that could devastate populations lacking immunity to local pathogens. Survival in these environments required detailed knowledge of local plants for food and medicine, understanding of seasonal weather patterns, and social cooperation that ensured community resources were shared appropriately during times of scarcity. Both civilizations developed in environments where the boundary between the natural and spiritual worlds was remarkably fluid, creating worldviews that integrated practical knowledge with spiritual understanding in ways that modern secular thinking often struggles to comprehend. Greeks consulted oracles whose pronouncements influenced major political and military decisions, participated in mystery religions that promised direct contact with divine forces, and understood natural phenomena as manifestations of divine personalities with whom humans could potentially communicate. Mexicans lived in a universe where every natural phenomenon carried spiritual significance that required appropriate recognition and response. The movement of celestial bodies, the growth patterns of maize, the behavior of animals, and the changing of seasons were all understood as communications from spiritual forces that shaped human destiny and required careful attention and appropriate ritual response. The complexity of religious life in both cultures would overwhelm most contemporary people who are accustomed to simplified spiritual practices that can be accomplished quickly without extensive preparation or community involvement. Greek religious calendars involved hundreds of festivals throughout the year, many requiring specific ritual knowledge, expensive offerings, and participation that could last for days and interfere significantly with other activities. Mexican religious observances were even more intricate, involving ceremonies that could last for weeks and required precise choreography, specialized costumes made from rare materials, and offerings that had to be prepared according to ancient traditions passed down through generations of trained specialists. The failure to perform these rituals correctly was believed to have serious consequences for individuals and entire communities. Education in both societies was primarily practical and spiritual rather than academic in the modern sense, focusing on the development of skills, knowledge, and character traits that would be essential for effective participation in community life. Greek boys learned athletics to develop physical fitness and competitive spirit, music to understand mathematical relationships and cultural traditions, and rhetoric to participate effectively in political discussions and legal proceedings. Mexican young people learned their adult roles through apprenticeships and ceremonial participation that began in early childhood and continued throughout their lives. With education understood as a lifelong process of spiritual and practical development rather than a discrete period of formal schooling that could be completed and left behind. The technological achievements of both civilizations were remarkable yet operated on principles that would confuse and challenge modern people accustomed to standardized tools, written instructions, and mechanical precision. Greeks created architectural marvels using basic tools and human labor, achieving mathematical precision that required understanding of proportions, engineering principles, and material properties that were passed down through practical apprenticeships rather than written texts. Mexican engineering was equally impressive but focused on different challenges that reflected their unique environmental conditions and cultural priorities. The floating gardens of Tenochtitlan represented an agricultural innovation that allowed a city of hundreds of thousands to thrive in the middle of a lake, requiring sophisticated understanding of soil composition, water management, plant biology, and construction techniques that modern engineers study with admiration. The construction of pyramids and temples required organizational skills and mathematical knowledge that coordinated the efforts of thousands of workers across decades of construction, involving precise astronomical alignments, complex symbolic programs, and structural engineering that has withstood centuries of earthquakes and environmental challenges. As we settle deeper into our evening contemplation, imagine the smoke from our fireplace carrying these images of ancient life up into the night sky, where the same stars that guided ancient navigators continue their eternal dance across the heavens. The flames dance lower now, casting a warm glow that connects us across the centuries to those ancient peoples who also gathered around fires to share stories, make plans, find comfort in the community of others, and contemplate the mysteries of existence that continue to challenge and inspire human beings regardless of the particular time and place in which they find themselves. Both Greek and Mexican civilizations understood the importance of oral tradition in preserving knowledge that could not be adequately captured in written texts, relying on professional storytellers, poets, and historians who maintained cultural memory through carefully memorized narratives that could be recited during long winter evenings, much like the one we are imagining tonight. These oral traditions served not only as entertainment, but as repositories of practical knowledge, moral guidance, historical information, and spiritual wisdom that shaped individual character and community identity across generations of cultural transmission. As the fire burns lower and the evening deepens around us like a gentle embrace, we find ourselves approaching the threshold between our familiar modern world and the alien landscapes of ancient civilizations that existed in times when every aspect of daily life required skills, knowledge, and physical capabilities that would challenge contemporary people in ways they could hardly imagine. Picture yourself walking along a moonlit path that seems to stretch backward through time itself, each step taking you further from the contemporary comforts and conveniences we take for granted and closer to ways of life that would challenge every assumption about daily existence, human relationships, and our place in the natural world. The transition begins subtly, like stepping from one dream into another, each detail gradually revealing the profound differences between our world and theirs. The electric lights of modern civilization fade behind you, their steady artificial glow replaced by the silver radiance of moonlight filtering through clouds and the distant flicker of oil lamps and torch flames that create pools of warm light in the darkness. The smooth, Paved roads beneath your feet give way to packed earth paths worn smooth by countless bare feet and sandaled travelers who carried news, goods, stories, and cultural traditions between distant communities across landscapes that could be treacherous and unpredictable. These ancient pathways were not simply routes for transportation but networks of cultural exchange where merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, diplomats, and wanderers shared information that connected isolated communities to larger patterns of trade, politics, warfare, and spiritual practice. Walking these paths required knowledge of seasonal weather patterns, understanding of local customs and languages, awareness of political boundaries and military conflicts, and the physical conditioning necessary to cover long distances while carrying everything needed for survival. Approaching ancient Mexico, you would first notice the scents carried on the evening air, aromas that would immediately signal your entry into a world organized around completely different principles of daily life and environmental relationship. The sharp smell of wood smoke mixed with unfamiliar spices would drift across the landscape, carrying hints of copal incense burning in distant temples, the green humidity of tropical vegetation releasing exotic fragrances unknown to temperate climates, and the distinctive scent of foods being prepared using ingredients and cooking methods that had been developed over centuries of cultural innovation. These olfactory signals would provide your first indication that you were entering a world where every aspect of daily life was connected to the natural environment in ways that modern urban living has largely eliminated. The incense burning in temples was not simply ceremonial but served practical purposes including insect control, air purification, and the creation of atmospheric conditions believed to facilitate communication with spiritual forces that governed weather, agriculture, and community well-being. The sounds would be equally foreign, creating an acoustic landscape that would require your ears to adjust to entirely different patterns of human and natural activity. Instead of the mechanical noises that provide the constant background soundtrack of modern life, you would hear the rhythmic grinding of corn on stone metates as families prepared their daily tortillas, the distant echo of conch shell horns announcing ceremonial times and community gatherings, and the soft shuffle of feet on stone steps as people moved about their evening routines according to schedules determined by natural light cycles rather than artificial timekeeping devices. Voices would carry through the air speaking languages whose tonal qualities and rhythmic patterns would be utterly unfamiliar to modern ears accustomed to the particular sound patterns of contemporary languages. These ancient languages encoded different ways of understanding time, space, relationships, and spiritual reality that reflected worldviews fundamentally different from modern secular materialism. The musical instruments that provided entertainment and spiritual accompaniment would create sounds that might seem strange or even unsettling to ears trained on modern musical scales and harmonic relationships. Drums made from animal skin stretched over wooden frames, flutes carved from bone or clay, and rattles filled with seeds or stones would combine to create rhythmic patterns that could last for hours and were designed to induce specific states of consciousness rather than simply provide pleasurable listening experiences. In ancient Greece, the sensory transition would be equally dramatic but manifested differently according to the particular environmental conditions and cultural practices that characterized Mediterranean civilizations. The climate would surround you with the scent of olive trees releasing their distinctive aroma, wild herbs growing in rocky soil, and the salt tang of nearby seas that influenced weather patterns and provided resources for communities that depended heavily on maritime activities. The sound of wooden cart wheels on stone roads would replace any mechanical noise, creating a constant low rumble punctuated by the calling of merchants advertising their wares, the lowing of oxen being driven to market, and the distant music of pipes and lyres drifting from evening gatherings where community members shared food, wine, stories, and cultural traditions that maintained social cohesion across generations. Greek architectural acoustics were sophisticated enough to carry human voices across large spaces without amplification, allowing public speakers to address crowds of thousands in amphitheaters and agoras designed with mathematical precision to optimize sound transmission. Understanding how to project your voice effectively in these spaces required training and practice that most modern people lack. As you draw closer to these ancient worlds, the architecture begins to reveal itself in the moonlight, presenting forms and proportions that would challenge modern assumptions about the relationship between buildings and their environment. Mexican structures would appear as massive geometric forms rising from the landscape like mathematical concepts made manifest in stone, their surfaces covered with intricate carvings that seem to writhe and dance in the shifting shadows cast by torches and moonlight. These buildings were not simply functional spaces for shelter and activity, but cosmic diagrams carved in stone, designed to align with celestial movements and channel spiritual energies that were believed to influence human destiny. The pyramids, temples, and palace complexes were essentially three-dimensional calendars and astronomical instruments that tracked the movements of sun, moon, planets, and stars with precision that modern astronomers admire for its accuracy and sophistication. The construction of these monuments required organizational capabilities that could coordinate the efforts of thousands of workers across decades of sustained activity involving quarrying, transportation, and placement of massive stone blocks using techniques that archaeologists and engineers continue to study and debate. The mathematical knowledge necessary for these projects included understanding of proportions, angles, astronomical alignments, and structural engineering that was passed down through apprenticeship systems rather than written texts. Greek architecture would present a different aesthetic entirely, characterized by harmonious proportions and clean lines that reflected mathematical principles of beauty and balance derived from philosophical investigations into the nature of cosmic order. Columns would rise in perfect symmetry, supporting structures that achieved elegance through simplicity rather than ornate complexity, demonstrating cultural values that emphasized rational clarity and geometric harmony. The marble used in Greek construction was quarried from specific locations chosen for the quality and color of the stone, transported across difficult terrain using human and animal labor, and carved by skilled artisans who spent years learning to work with tools that required physical strength and artistic sensitivity that few contemporary people possess. The approach to both civilizations would require mental preparation for social structures that operated according to principles that might seem harsh or unfamiliar to modern sensibilities shaped by democratic ideals and egalitarian assumptions. Hierarchy was explicit and visible in every aspect of daily life, from clothing and hairstyles to speech patterns and living arrangements. Creating social environments where understanding your place within complex ranking systems would be essential for survival and success. In Mexican societies, your social position would be immediately apparent to everyone you encountered, from the way you dressed, the ornaments you wore, and even the specific ways you were permitted to arrange your hair according to laws that regulated personal appearance. The feathers you could wear, the colors available to you in clothing and decorations, and the materials of your jewelry would all communicate precise information about your status, occupation, family connections, and regional origins that observers could read like a complex social text. The failure to dress appropriately for your social position could result in severe penalties, including public humiliation, economic sanctions, or even physical punishment, creating pressure to understand and conform to visual codes that were elaborate and specific. Learning these systems would require years of careful observation and cultural education that most modern people would find overwhelming in their complexity and rigidity. Greek social structures were equally complex, but expressed differently through systems that emphasized education, athletic achievement, economic status, and family lineage rather than purely hereditary rank. Your accent would immediately identify your city-state of origin to anyone who heard you speak, while your clothing and bearing would indicate your economic status and educational background to observers trained to read these social signals. The ability to quote poetry from memory, understand philosophical references, participate effectively in athletic competitions, and contribute meaningfully to political discussions would all factor into how others perceived and interacted with you in social situations where intellectual and physical capabilities were constantly being evaluated and compared. As you crossed the threshold into these ancient worlds, you would need to adjust not only your expectations about physical comfort and convenience, but also your understanding of time itself, which operated according to temporal rhythms that were intimately connected to natural cycles and spiritual observances that regulated community life in ways that modern people might find restrictive or incomprehensible. Mexican concepts of time were particularly complex and sophisticated, involving multiple overlapping calendar systems that tracked different types of cyclical events simultaneously with mathematical precision that required specialized training to understand and apply. The sacred calendar of 260 days intersected with the solar calendar of 365 days to create larger cycles that governed everything from market days and agricultural activities to the timing of wars, marriages, and religious ceremonies. These calendar systems were not simply practical tools for organizing activities, but spiritual technologies that connected human life to cosmic rhythms believed to influence individual destiny and community well-being. Understanding when to plant crops, conduct ceremonies, begin journeys, or make important decisions required consulting priests who had spent decades learning to calculate the interactions between multiple simultaneous cycles that tracked lunar phases, planetary movements, and seasonal variations. Greek time consciousness was equally foreign to modern experience, though organized around different principles that reflected their particular environmental conditions and cultural priorities. The day was divided into periods related to agricultural and household activities rather than precise mechanical measurements, with dawn, midday, and sunset serving as the primary temporal markers that influenced when various activities could be appropriately undertaken. Seasonal variations affected the length and timing of daily routines in ways that modern people, accustomed to artificial lighting and climate control, would find disruptive and inconvenient. Winter days required different scheduling than summer days, and community activities had to be planned around weather patterns that could not be predicted with modern meteorological accuracy. Your first evening in either civilization would likely be spent in careful observation, trying to understand the unspoken rules that governed interaction between people of different ages, genders, social classes, and regional origins. The gestures, facial expressions, and vocal tones that indicated respect, hierarchy, and social appropriateness would all need to be learned through careful attention to the behavior of others. Since mistakes in social protocol could have serious consequences for your acceptance and safety within the community. The physical discomfort would begin almost immediately, as your body attempted to adapt to living conditions that lacked most of the conveniences that modern people consider essential for basic comfort. Without modern cushioning, heating systems, or electric lighting, your body would need to adjust to sleeping on hard surfaces, staying warm with only woven textiles and body heat, and navigating in darkness using only moonlight and small flames for illumination. The absence of comfortable furniture would require developing new ways of sitting, sleeping, and working that used different muscle groups and demanded flexibility that sedentary modern lifestyles do not maintain. The lack of insulation in buildings would mean experiencing temperature variations that modern climate control systems eliminate, requiring clothing and behavioral adaptations that could maintain body temperature across daily and seasonal cycles. Food would present another immediate challenge that could prove overwhelming for digestive systems accustomed to processed, standardized, and chemically preserved modern foods. The flavors, textures, and preparation methods would be completely unfamiliar. While the social rituals surrounding eating would require careful observation to avoid giving offense through inappropriate behavior during meals that served important social and spiritual functions beyond simple nutrition. The Mexican use of chilies and complex spice combinations would assault taste buds accustomed to blander fare, potentially causing physical discomfort that could last for days while your system adapted to ingredients that were fundamental to local cuisine. Greek cuisine heavy on olive oil, fermented fish sauces, and wine might be equally challenging for different reasons, requiring digestive adaptations that could take weeks to develop. As we imagine crossing these thresholds into ancient worlds, the fire in our hearth burns even lower, creating an atmosphere of contemplative shadows that helps us understand how different levels of illumination affect perception, mood, and the rhythms of daily activity. The gentle warmth radiating from the glowing coals provides a small anchor of comfort as we mentally prepare to explore ways of life that would test every assumption about human civilization, individual autonomy, and the relationship between humans and their environment. The evening air grows cooler around our comfortable modern space, and we pull our contemporary comforts closer around us, grateful for the simple pleasures of reliable heating, soft furnishings, and the peaceful security of modern life while we explore these ancient worlds safely through imagination and historical understanding that connects us across the centuries to the struggles and achievements of our ancestors. The fire has settled into a steady glow of red coals that pulse with rhythmic warmth, providing just enough light to continue our gentle journey into the daily rhythms of ancient civilizations that operated according to principles so different from our own that understanding them requires us to completely reimagine what it means to be human in relationship to the natural world, community, and the mysterious forces that govern existence. As we transition deeper into these historical worlds, we begin to understand how profoundly different the most basic aspects of existence would be for someone accustomed to modern conveniences, individual autonomy, and the technological solutions that have transformed contemporary life into something that ancient peoples would find incomprehensible. Waking up in ancient Mexico would begin before dawn, as the entire community synchronized their activities with the rising sun in ways that reflected sophisticated understanding of circadian rhythms and the relationship between human energy cycles and natural light patterns. The absence of artificial lighting meant that darkness truly brought most activities to a halt, making the early morning hours precious for accomplishing necessary tasks before the heat of midday made outdoor work dangerous or impossible. You would rise from a sleeping mat woven from plant fibers using techniques that had been refined over generations, perhaps spread over a raised platform made from packed earth and stones that provided insulation from ground moisture and small creatures. The sleeping arrangements themselves would challenge modern expectations about privacy, comfort, and individual space, as families often shared single rooms where multiple generations lived, worked, and slept together according to social arrangements that balanced practical needs with cultural traditions governing appropriate relationships between people of different ages and genders. Understanding these sleeping customs would be essential for avoiding social conflicts that could have serious consequences for your acceptance within the community. The first task upon waking would be rekindling the cooking fire from carefully preserved coals, a process that required considerable skill, patience, and understanding of combustion principles that most modern people have never needed to develop. Striking sparks from flint and steel was not a simple matter of applying modern lighter technology, but demanded understanding of metallurgy, geology, and the physics of fire starting that could take years to master effectively. The tinder used to catch those precious sparks had to be prepared in advance using specific plant materials that were gathered during appropriate seasons, processed using traditional techniques, and stored under conditions that would keep them perfectly dry and immediately combustible when needed. The failure to maintain fire overnight could mean hours of difficulty in the morning, or the social humiliation of borrowing flames from neighbors who might question your competence and reliability as a community member. Fire management was not simply a practical skill, but a spiritual responsibility that connected households to cosmic forces believed to govern prosperity, health, and spiritual well-being. The rituals surrounding fire lighting, maintenance, and extinguishing were elaborate ceremonies that acknowledged the sacred nature of this fundamental technology that made human civilization possible in environments that could be hostile to survival without careful attention to resource management. Personal hygiene in ancient Mexico involved elaborate rituals that served both practical and spiritual purposes, reflecting understanding that cleanliness was essential for physical health, social acceptance, and spiritual purity that could affect your relationships with other people and with divine forces that governed individual and community destiny. Bathing was considered essential for spiritual as well as physical cleanliness, but it involved cold water and rough textiles rather than the warm, sudsy comfort of modern washing facilities. The soap substitutes were made from plant roots like the soap tree root that had to be gathered during specific seasons, prepared using traditional processing techniques, and stored properly to maintain their cleansing properties throughout the year. The knowledge required to identify, harvest, and process these natural cleansing agents was specialized information that was typically passed down through family lines or acquired through apprenticeships with experienced practitioners. The water used for bathing often came from sources that required significant labor to access, transport, and store, making personal cleanliness a community activity that involved cooperation between family members and neighbors who shared responsibility for maintaining adequate water supplies for household needs. The containers used for water storage were made from materials like clay and gourds that required specific skills to produce and maintain. Greek morning routines were similarly challenging but reflected different cultural priorities that emphasized physical fitness, intellectual development, and social interaction in ways that modern individualistic lifestyles would find demanding and potentially overwhelming. The gymnasium culture meant that physical exercise was considered essential for free male citizens, but this involved training naked in outdoor courtyards using only olive oil for cleansing afterward. Practices that required abandoning modern concepts of privacy and bodily modesty. The exercises performed in Greek gymnasia were not simply recreational activities but serious training regimens that prepared young men for military service, athletic competitions, and the physical demands of daily life in a society that required considerable strength and endurance for survival. Wrestling, running, discus throwing, and other activities demanded levels of physical conditioning that most contemporary people would find impossibly difficult to achieve and maintain. The concept of privacy that modern people take for granted was largely absent from Greek bathing and exercise practices, where communal activities served important social functions that reinforced community bonds, established social hierarchies, and provided opportunities for older men to mentor younger ones in skills that went far beyond physical training to include moral instruction and cultural education. Breakfast in both civilizations would be minimal by modern standards, consisting of foods that provided basic nutrition while conserving resources for more elaborate meals later in the day when social activities and religious observances required more substantial feasting. Greeks typically began the day with bread dipped in wine, perhaps supplemented with olives or cheese if available, combinations that reflected the agricultural products that could be reliably produced in Mediterranean climates. The bread consumed in ancient Greece was dense and dark, ground from grain that contained more chaff and impurities than contemporary wheat products, requiring strong jaws and healthy teeth to chew effectively. The grinding of grain was typically women's work that required considerable physical strength and could take hours each day to produce enough flour for family needs. Wine was consumed because water quality was often unreliable, carrying diseases that could devastate communities lacking modern water treatment technologies. But it was typically diluted with water to reduce its intoxicating effects while still providing the antiseptic benefits that made it safer than untreated water sources. Understanding proper wine dilution ratios was important knowledge that affected both health and social respectability. Mexican morning meals might consist of atole, a thin gruel made from ground corn that could be flavored with chili, honey, or other ingredients depending on family wealth and seasonal availability. The preparation of corn involved complex processes that reflected sophisticated understanding of nutrition and food chemistry that modern food science has only recently begun to appreciate fully. The process of preparing corn involved soaking the kernels in lime water to remove the outer hull through a chemical process called nixtamalization that not only made the grain easier to grind but also increased its nutritional value by making essential amino acids more bioavailable. This technique, developed through centuries of experimentation, prevented pellagra and other nutritional deficiency diseases that plagued populations dependent on unprocessed corn. The grinding of the softened grain on a stone metate using a cylindrical stone mano was labor-intensive work that required significant upper body strength and could take several hours each day to produce flour fine enough for cooking tortillas and other corn-based foods. Learning to use a metate effectively was a skill that young women typically acquired through years of practice under the guidance of older female relatives. The clothing you would wear in either civilization reflected both practical needs for protection from environmental conditions and strict social regulations that governed personal appearance according to complex systems of status, occupation, and cultural identity that could be read by anyone who understood the visual codes that regulated dress and ornamentation. In Mexico, the right to wear certain colors, patterns, and materials was regulated by law, with severe penalties for inappropriate display of status symbols that could confuse social hierarchies and disrupt community order. Cotton clothing was a luxury available only to the nobility, while commoners wore garments made from maguey fiber that was rougher against the skin and required different weaving techniques that produced fabrics with distinctive textures and appearances. The production of clothing involved complex processes that began with growing or gathering raw materials, continued through spinning, dyeing, and weaving stages that could take months to complete, and concluded with tailoring and decoration that reflected individual creativity within socially acceptable parameters. Understanding these clothing production systems was essential knowledge for anyone hoping to maintain appropriate appearance and social standing. Greek clothing was somewhat simpler in construction but equally regulated by social expectations that connected personal appearance to moral character, economic status, and cultural sophistication. The chiton and himation were essentially draped rectangles of fabric that required considerable skill to arrange properly and maintain decent coverage during daily activities that involved physical labor, social interaction, and public appearance. The quality of the wool used in Greek garments, the fineness of the weave, and the presence of expensive dyes all communicated social and economic information to observers who were trained to read these visual signals as indicators of family wealth, personal achievements, and social connections that could influence political and economic opportunities. Working through the morning hours would involve tasks that modern people might find impossibly strenuous, requiring physical capabilities, specialized knowledge, and cooperative relationships that contemporary individualistic lifestyles rarely develop or maintain. Mexican agriculture required intimate knowledge of seasonal patterns, soil conditions, and plant varieties that had been developed over generations of careful observation, experimentation, and selection that produced crops adapted to local environmental conditions. The famous Three Sisters planting of corn, beans, and squash together represented sophisticated understanding of companion planting that maximized yields while maintaining soil fertility through nitrogen fixation and efficient use of available space and water resources. This agricultural system supported much larger populations than would have been possible using single-crop farming methods that deplete soil nutrients and require extensive fallowing. Greek agriculture was equally demanding but adapted to different environmental conditions that required different strategies for dealing with rocky soils, irregular rainfall, and Mediterranean climate patterns that could be unpredictable and challenging for food production. Olive cultivation required enormous patience and long-term planning, as trees took decades to mature and produce significant harvests that could support families and communities. Grape growing involved careful attention to pruning techniques, soil preparation, and timing of harvest that could make the difference between prosperity and hunger for entire communities whose economic survival depended on successful wine production. The knowledge required for viticulture was complex and specialized, involving understanding of plant biology, soil chemistry, weather patterns, and fermentation processes that took years to master. The social interactions throughout the morning would require constant attention to nuances of hierarchy, respect, and appropriate behavior that governed every aspect of interpersonal relationships according to complex systems of social organization that maintained community order through elaborate codes of conduct. Speaking to the wrong person in the wrong tone, using inappropriate gestures, or failing to observe proper protocols could have serious consequences for your standing in the community and your access to economic opportunities, social support, and political protection. In Mexican societies, the relationship between social classes was maintained through elaborate systems of tribute and reciprocal obligation that created networks of mutual dependence extending throughout the community and connecting local groups to regional and imperial political structures. Understanding who owed what to whom, and when these obligations needed to be fulfilled, required intimate knowledge of community relationships that outsiders would find bewildering in their complexity and demanding in their social expectations. Greek social navigation was equally complex but operated according to different principles that emphasized personal honor, family reputation, and civic responsibility in ways that connected individual behavior to community welfare and political stability. The concept of honor was central to all interactions, with perceived slights potentially leading to conflicts that could last for generations and affect entire extended families through cycles of revenge and reconciliation. Learning to give and receive respect appropriately required understanding subtle distinctions in speech patterns, gesture, and public behavior that communicated social status, political allegiances, and moral character to observers who evaluated every interaction according to cultural standards that could be unforgiving of mistakes or social violations. The midday heat would bring different challenges in each civilization, requiring strategies for dealing with extreme temperatures that could be dangerous for people unaccustomed to working in hot climates without modern cooling technologies. Mexican highlands could be scorching during the day despite cold nights, creating dramatic temperature variations that required careful timing of activities and understanding of how to seek appropriate shelter during the most intense hours of solar radiation. The humidity in tropical lowland areas would be overwhelming for anyone not acclimated to conditions that modern air conditioning systems are designed to eliminate, requiring clothing choices, work schedules, and behavioral adaptations that allowed people to function effectively despite environmental conditions that could be physiologically challenging and potentially dangerous. Greek summers presented their own difficulties, with temperatures that could make outdoor work hazardous during the hottest hours, requiring cultural institutions like the afternoon rest period that was not simply luxury but necessity for avoiding heat exhaustion and dehydration in a climate where cooling strategies were limited to shade, water, and reduction of physical activity during peak temperature periods. As we contemplate these morning and midday challenges from the comfort of our evening fireside, the warmth emanating from the glowing coals reminds us of how central fire was to survival in these ancient worlds, where every flame had to be carefully tended, every fuel source gathered and preserved, and every cooking fire planned and managed with attention to efficiency, safety, and the social protocols that governed resource sharing within communities that depended on cooperation for survival. The evening air outside our comfortable space grows cooler, and we appreciate the simple luxury of adjustable heating that allows us to maintain perfect comfort without constant attention to fuel supplies, fire management, or the complex social negotiations that would have surrounded resource access in ancient communities where individual survival depended on maintaining appropriate relationships with neighbors, family members, and community leaders who controlled access to essential resources. Our journey into these ancient worlds continues to deepen our appreciation for the myriad small conveniences that make modern life comfortable, while also developing admiration for the resilience, skill, and cultural sophistication of peoples who created remarkable civilizations despite physical challenges that would overwhelm most contemporary people within days of exposure to the demanding realities of pre-industrial life. The coals in our fireplace pulse with steady warmth as we settle more deeply into understanding the intricate rhythms that govern daily life in ancient civilizations, where every aspect of human activity was synchronized with natural cycles that modern industrial societies have largely abandoned in favor of artificial schedules determined by economic efficiency rather than environmental harmony. The evening has progressed to that peaceful hour when the day's activities wind down naturally, and we can contemplate the profound differences between modern scheduling systems based on mechanical timekeeping and the organic cycles that organized ancient Mexican and Greek societies according to principles that honored both human needs and cosmic order. In the world of ancient Mexico, afternoon hours brought a shift in community activities that reflected the sophisticated understanding these civilizations had developed about human energy cycles, environmental conditions, and the relationship between individual well-being and collective productivity. As the sun reached its zenith and temperatures climbed to levels that could be dangerous for sustained physical activity, many outdoor tasks would cease, and people would seek shelter in the cool shadows of buildings designed specifically to provide relief from intense heat while maintaining air circulation that made interior spaces comfortable even during the hottest parts of the day. This afternoon rest period was not simply a luxury enjoyed by wealthy elites but a practical necessity that was built into the social and economic structures of communities that understood the importance of coordinating human activity with environmental rhythms that could not be controlled or modified through technological intervention. The failure to respect these natural limits could result in heat exhaustion, dehydration, and other medical emergencies that communities lacked modern resources to treat effectively. The architecture itself was part of a complex system for managing daily comfort that integrated understanding of solar angles, prevailing wind patterns, thermal mass, and ventilation principles that could create interior environments dramatically cooler than exterior temperatures. Mexican buildings were oriented to capture prevailing breezes and create cross-ventilation that could lower interior temperatures by 10 or 15 degrees, making the difference between comfortable habitation and dangerous overheating during peak temperature periods. Courtyards were designed to create thermal chimneys that drew hot air upward while pulling cooler air through living spaces, creating circulation patterns that maintained comfortable conditions throughout structures that could house dozens or even hundreds of people. Understanding how to position yourself within these architectural systems to take advantage of cooling effects would be essential knowledge for surviving the climate without modern air conditioning technology. The building materials used in construction were selected not only for their structural properties but also for their thermal characteristics that could moderate temperature swings and create comfortable interior environments. Stone and adobe absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly during cooler evening hours, providing natural temperature regulation that required understanding of physics principles that modern climate control systems replicate through mechanical means. Greek settlements showed similar sophistication in environmental adaptation, though the specific strategies reflected different climatic challenges and available materials that shaped distinctive approaches to creating comfortable living spaces in Mediterranean conditions. The use of marble and stone in construction was not simply aesthetic preference but practical application of materials science that utilized thermal mass to moderate temperature fluctuations and create interior environments that remained comfortable throughout daily and seasonal cycles. The thick walls characteristic of Greek construction provided insulation that kept interior spaces cool during hot summer days and retained heat during cold winter nights. reducing the need for fuel consumption while maintaining habitable conditions throughout the year. The small windows typical of Greek architecture minimized heat gain during summer while allowing sufficient light for interior activities. The afternoon period in both civilizations became a time for activities that required less physical exertion but maintained cultural and spiritual life through pursuits that could be conducted in shade while avoiding the physical demands that could be dangerous. During peak heat periods, this was when artisans worked on delicate crafts that required good lighting and steady hands, when children received instruction in cultural traditions, and when community members gathered to share information and maintain social bonds that held societies together across generations. Mexican craft production during these hours was remarkably sophisticated, involving techniques and materials that modern industrial processes struggle to replicate despite access to advanced technologies and scientific understanding. Feather workers created intricate mosaics using hundreds of individual feathers arranged in patterns that required mathematical precision and artistic vision that combined aesthetic beauty with symbolic meaning that communicated complex cultural information to trained observers. The tools used for this delicate work were simple by modern standards but employed with incredible skill acquired through years of patient practice under the guidance of master craftsmen who guarded their techniques as family secrets passed down through generations of specialized knowledge. Obsidian blades sharper than modern steel were used for cutting feathers with precision that allowed complex patterns and seamless transitions between different colors and textures. Natural adhesives made from plant resins were prepared using secret formulas that created bonds strong enough to last for centuries while remaining flexible enough to accommodate the movement and expansion of organic materials. These adhesives were often superior to modern synthetic alternatives in their durability and resistance to environmental degradation. Greek artisans working in pottery, metalwork, and textile production also required afternoon lighting and cooler temperatures for their most detailed work, creating objects that combined functional utility with artistic beauty in ways that modern mass production systems rarely achieve. The red figure pottery that modern museums display was created by painters working with brushes made from animal hair, using pigments that had to be prepared fresh each day and applied with timing that coordinated with the firing schedules of kilns that operated according to natural temperature cycles. The geometric patterns that decorated Greek pottery were not simply decorative elements but encoded mathematical relationships, mythological references, and cultural information that could be read by educated observers as texts that preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations. Learning to create these patterns required understanding of proportion, symmetry, and symbolic systems that took years to master. Greek metalwork involved techniques for working bronze, iron, and precious metals that required understanding of metallurgy, chemistry, and physics that was gained through practical experimentation and apprenticeship training rather than theoretical study. The tools and weapons produced by Greek smiths were often superior to modern replicas in their balance, durability, and effectiveness for their intended purposes. The social gathering that occurred during afternoon hours served multiple functions beyond simple entertainment, creating opportunities for community decision-making, educational transmission, and social bonding that maintained cultural continuity and collective identity. These were times when community decisions were discussed through consensus-building processes that could take hours or even days to resolve, when young people learned adult skills through observation and participation, and when the oral traditions that preserved cultural knowledge were transmitted to new generations through storytelling, song, and ceremonial instruction. Mexican storytelling traditions were particularly rich during these periods, involving professional narrators who maintained vast repertoires of historical accounts, mythological cycles, and genealogical information that could be recited for hours at a time without repetition. These stories were not simply entertainment, but repositories of practical knowledge about agriculture, medicine, law, and spiritual practice that guided individual and community decision-making. Learning to remember and accurately transmit these oral texts required training that began in childhood and continued throughout life, using mnemonic techniques that employed rhythm, melody, visual imagery, and physical gesture to encode information in forms that could be recalled with perfect accuracy across decades of performance. The storytellers who mastered these techniques were essentially human libraries who preserved cultural knowledge that would otherwise be lost. Greek educational practices during afternoon hours involved similar emphasis on memory and oral transmission, though organized around different content that reflected their particular cultural priorities and intellectual traditions. Young men learned extensive passages of poetry by heart, not simply for cultural enrichment, but because these texts contained practical information about navigation, agriculture, legal precedents, and moral guidance that would be essential throughout their adult lives. The epic poems of Homer were not merely literary entertainment but educational texts that preserved historical information, geographical knowledge, technological instructions, and ethical teachings that provided frameworks for understanding appropriate behavior in various situations that could arise during adult life. Learning to recite these poems accurately required years of practice and provided mental training that developed memory, concentration, and verbal skills essential for effective participation in political and legal activities. The preparation for evening meals began during these afternoon hours and involved complex coordination of ingredients, cooking methods, timing, and social arrangements that would challenge modern cooks accustomed to standardized ingredients, precise temperature controls, and simplified preparation techniques. Mexican cuisine required understanding the different varieties of corn, beans, and squash that were available in different seasons, each with specific cooking properties and nutritional contributions that affected family health and community well-being. The nixtamalization process for preparing corn was particularly complex, involving careful timing of lime treatment, grinding stages, and moisture content that affected the final texture, nutritional value, and keeping qualities of tortillas and other corn-based foods. Failure to execute this process correctly could result in food that was not only unpalatable but nutritionally inadequate, potentially leading to deficiency diseases that were common in populations dependent on improperly prepared corn. The lime used in this process had to be prepared by burning limestone or shells at high temperatures, requiring understanding of chemistry and fire management that took considerable skill to execute safely and effectively. The timing of adding lime to corn, the duration of soaking, and the methods used for washing and grinding all affected the final product in ways that required experience and judgment that could only be acquired through years of practice. Greek cooking presented different challenges but required equally specialized knowledge that connected food preparation to cultural traditions, religious observances, and social relationships that extended far beyond simple nutrition. The olive oil that was central to Mediterranean cuisine came in various grades with different flavor profiles and cooking properties that had to be matched appropriately to specific dishes and cooking methods. Understanding which oil to use for different preparations, how to store it properly to prevent rancidity, and how to judge quality through sensory evaluation required experience that was typically gained through years of observation and practice under the guidance of skilled cooks who maintained family traditions and regional specialties. The adulteration of olive oil was a serious concern that required knowledge of detection methods and reliable sources. The spices and seasonings available to both civilizations were limited compared to modern global trade networks but used with sophistication that maximized their impact while respecting seasonal availability and cultural traditions that governed appropriate combinations and cooking methods. Mexican cooks developed complex combinations of different chili varieties, each contributing specific flavors and heat levels that complemented particular ingredients and cooking techniques. The grinding, toasting, and blending of these spices required techniques that were passed down through family lines and regional traditions, with master cooks guarding their recipes as valuable intellectual property that could provide economic advantages and social prestige. The preparation of spice pastes often began days in advance of cooking and involved multiple processing stages that developed flavors and textures that could not be achieved through modern shortcuts. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, both civilizations began preparations for the social and spiritual activities that would occupy the hours between sunset and sleep, involving not only food and drink preparation but also the arrangement of spaces, the preparation of ceremonial objects, and the mental and spiritual preparation of participants for activities that served important cultural and religious functions beyond simple entertainment or relaxation. Greek symposia were elaborate affairs that required careful planning of guest lists, seating arrangements, entertainment programs, and conversation topics that would maintain appropriate social dynamics throughout extended gatherings that could last well into the night. The mixing of wine in proper proportions, the selection of appropriate music, and the timing of various activities all required understanding of cultural norms that could take years to master and apply effectively. The preparation of symposium spaces involved arranging furniture, lighting, and decorative elements that created appropriate atmospheres for intellectual discussion, artistic performance, and social interaction that balanced formality with relaxation in ways that encouraged meaningful exchange while maintaining social hierarchies and cultural expectations. Mexican evening gatherings were equally complex but organized around different principles that emphasized spiritual practice, community decision-making, and cultural transmission rather than purely social entertainment. The use of sacred spaces within residential compounds, the burning of specific incenses that created appropriate atmospheric conditions, and the timing of activities to coordinate with astronomical events all required knowledge that connected daily life to larger cosmological patterns that governed individual and community destiny. The preparation of ceremonial objects, the selection of appropriate clothing and ornaments, and the mental and spiritual preparation required for meaningful participation in these gatherings involved understanding of cultural codes and spiritual practices that took years to learn and could have serious consequences for individuals and communities if performed incorrectly or inappropriately. As we continue our contemplation beside the glowing coals of our fireplace, we begin to appreciate how these ancient peoples created richness and meaning in their lives through attention to details and relationships that modern people often overlook in their pursuit of efficiency and convenience. The afternoon hours we have been exploring were not simply downtime or rest periods, but integral parts of complex cultural systems that sustained community life across generations and created opportunities for artistic expression, spiritual development, and social bonding that enriched human experience in ways that modern individualistic lifestyles often fail to provide. The warmth radiating from our fire provides a gentle anchor of comfort as we prepare to explore the evening hours when these ancient civilizations truly came alive with social interaction, spiritual practice, and cultural expression that transformed the daily challenges of survival into opportunities for human flourishing, artistic creation, and spiritual development that continue to inspire and inform contemporary efforts to create meaningful and sustainable communities. As the embers in our fireplace settle into a mesmerizing glow that seems to pulse with the heartbeat of time itself, we find ourselves drawn deeper into the evening hours of ancient civilizations. When the practical demands of daylight gave way to the rich cultural life that sustained these remarkable societies through centuries of challenge and change. The soft light dancing across the walls of our quiet space mirrors the flickering of oil lamps and torch flames that illuminated gatherings where art, philosophy, storytelling, and spiritual practice transformed ordinary evenings into profound experiences of community connection, cultural transmission, and spiritual exploration that enriched human existence in ways that modern entertainment industries struggle to replicate despite access to sophisticated technologies and vast resources. In ancient Mexico, the transition from day to evening was marked by ceremonial activities that connected daily life to the cosmic order through elaborate rituals that acknowledged the sacred nature of time and the responsibility of human communities to maintain proper relationships with the spiritual forces that governed weather, agriculture, health, and prosperity. As shadows lengthened across courtyards and plazas that had been designed with mathematical precision to capture and amplify natural light throughout the day, conch shell horns would sound from temple pyramids, their deep, resonant tones carrying across the settlement to announce the approach of night and the beginning of evening rituals that varied according to the complex ceremonial calendar that tracked multiple overlapping cycles of sacred time. These ceremonial announcements were not simply community notifications but spiritual technologies that coordinated human activity with cosmic rhythms that were believed to influence individual destiny and collective well-being. The timing of these announcements required precise astronomical calculations that priests had spent decades learning to perform, involving understanding of solar and lunar cycles, planetary movements, and seasonal variations that affected everything from agricultural decisions to the scheduling of religious ceremonies and political activities. The gathering spaces where people assembled during these evening hours were architectural marvels that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of acoustics, optics, and social psychology that modern designers study for inspiration in creating performance venues and community centers. The courtyards and plazas could amplify voices and musical instruments in specific ways that created zones where speakers could be heard clearly by hundreds of listeners while maintaining intimate conversational spaces around the perimeter where smaller groups could interact without disturbing the central activities or compromising the acoustic environment for other participants. These acoustic properties were not accidental but the result of careful mathematical calculations that took into account the size and shape of spaces, the materials used in construction, and the positioning of architectural elements that could focus, direct, or disperse sound waves according to the specific requirements of different types of activities. The knowledge required to design these spaces represented sophisticated understanding of physics principles that modern acoustical engineers appreciate for their effectiveness and elegance. Mexican evening entertainment involved sophisticated musical performances using instruments that required remarkable skill to master and produce sounds that could induce specific states of consciousness in performers and audiences alike. The teponazli drums carved from single pieces of hardwood were not simply percussion instruments but complex musical technologies that could produce multiple distinct tones depending on where and how they were struck, allowing skilled musicians to create intricate rhythmic patterns that could continue for hours without repetition. Mastering these instruments required understanding of rhythm patterns that incorporated mathematical relationships connecting musical structure to calendar cycles and astronomical observations, creating performances that served not only entertainment functions but also educational and spiritual purposes that reinforced cultural knowledge and maintained community connections to cosmic order. The training required to achieve competence on these instruments typically began in early childhood and continued throughout life, with master musicians serving as community treasures whose knowledge and skills were essential for maintaining cultural traditions. The dance performances that accompanied these musical presentations were equally complex, involving choreography that told stories, preserved historical information, and induced spiritual states in both performers and observers through movements that had been refined over generations of cultural development. These dances were not simply entertainment, but living repositories of cultural knowledge that transmitted information about historical events, mythological narratives, moral teachings, and spiritual practices that could not be adequately preserved through other means. The costumes worn during these dances were not merely decorative but functional spiritual technology, with specific materials, colors, and designs that were believed to facilitate communication with spiritual forces and create appropriate atmospheric conditions for the transmission of sacred knowledge. The feathers, jewels, and textiles used in these costumes were often rare and expensive materials that had been acquired through extensive trade networks and processed using secret techniques that were regarded as valuable intellectual property. Greek evening symposia represented a different approach to cultural gathering, but demonstrated similar sophistication in their integration of intellectual, artistic, and social elements that created educational and entertainment experiences far more complex and rewarding than modern equivalents. These carefully orchestrated events brought together participants who were expected to contribute poetry, philosophical discussion, musical performance, and witty conversation according to elaborate rules that maintained appropriate balance between various forms of intellectual and artistic expression while reinforcing social hierarchies and cultural values. The planning required for successful symposia involved understanding of personality dynamics, intellectual capabilities, and social relationships that could influence the quality of discussions and the overall success of gatherings that served important functions in maintaining political alliances, cultural traditions, and intellectual development within communities that depended on personal relationships and oral communication for coordinating complex social and economic activities. The setting for Greek symposia involved furniture and spatial arrangements that modern people would find uncomfortable but which served specific cultural functions related to social hierarchy, philosophical discussion, and the consumption of food and wine in ways that enhanced rather than impaired intellectual activity. Reclining on couches while eating and drinking required physical conditioning and social skills that took years to develop, along with the ability to maintain eloquent conversation while managing complex social interactions that could have important political and economic consequences. The ability to participate effectively in symposia was considered a mark of education and cultural sophistication that could influence career opportunities, political advancement, and social standing within communities where intellectual achievement and cultural knowledge were highly valued and carefully evaluated by peers who had themselves spent years developing the skills and knowledge required for meaningful participation in these gatherings. The wine consumed during these gatherings was central to their social and spiritual function, but its use was regulated by traditions that prevented the simple intoxication that modern people might expect from social drinking events. Different wine varieties were selected for specific effects on mood and consciousness, mixed with water in proportions that varied throughout the evening according to ritual patterns, and consumed in coordination with food, conversation, and entertainment that enhanced rather than impaired the intellectual and artistic activities that were the primary purposes of these gatherings. Understanding proper wine etiquette required knowledge of varieties, preparation methods, serving protocols, and consumption patterns that reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between alcohol and consciousness, the social functions of communal drinking, and the cultural meanings of hospitality that connected individual behavior to community values and spiritual beliefs about the relationship between humans and divine forces. Greek poetry recitation during symposia involved memorization skills that would challenge modern minds accustomed to written texts and electronic assistance, requiring participants to maintain vast repertoires of epic, lyric, and dramatic poetry that could be quoted appropriately during conversations that moved fluidly between entertainment, education, and serious philosophical investigation. Professional rhapsodes could recite thousands of lines of epic poetry with perfect accuracy, but educated symposium participants were also expected to know extensive passages that they could contribute spontaneously to discussions and debates. The poetry recited during these gatherings was not simply entertainment but educational technology that preserved historical information, moral teachings, and cultural values in memorable forms that could be transmitted accurately across generations of oral tradition. Learning to recite poetry effectively required understanding of rhythm, melody, dramatic expression, and cultural context that connected individual performance to larger traditions of cultural preservation and transmission. The philosophical discussions that emerged during these gatherings were not casual conversations but serious investigations of fundamental questions about reality, ethics, knowledge, and human purpose that required participants to have spent years studying with teachers and reading texts that provided them with conceptual frameworks and analytical methods that enabled sophisticated intellectual exchange. These discussions often continued for hours and could influence important decisions about politics, law, education, and personal conduct that affected entire communities. The topics addressed during philosophical discussions included questions about the nature of justice, the relationship between individual and community, the structure of reality, the sources of knowledge, and the proper approach to death that modern people might consider abstract or impractical but which were understood as essential for living meaningful and effective lives. The ability to contribute meaningfully to these discussions required extensive education and intellectual development that was considered essential for responsible citizenship and leadership roles. In Mexican evening gatherings, the equivalent intellectual tradition involved elaborate storytelling that preserved historical information, mythological understandings, and practical knowledge in narrative forms that could be transmitted accurately across generations while providing entertainment and education that reinforced community values and cultural identity. These stories were not simply entertainment, but repositories of cultural wisdom that guided decision-making, legal judgments, and spiritual practices that affected individual and community well-being. The storytellers who maintained these traditions were professional specialists who had spent years learning vast repertoires of narratives that could be adapted to different audiences and occasions while preserving essential cultural information with accuracy that was essential for maintaining cultural continuity. These specialists were often among the most respected members of their communities, serving as advisors to political leaders and spiritual guides whose knowledge and wisdom were essential for community survival and prosperity. The codex books that recorded some of these traditions used pictographic writing systems that combined visual and phonetic elements in ways that required specialized training to read and interpret correctly, creating educational technologies that could preserve and transmit complex information while serving artistic and spiritual functions that connected written texts to larger cultural systems. The scribes who created these books were trained from childhood in artistic techniques, symbolic systems, and ritual practices that made them essential guardians of cultural knowledge and spiritual wisdom. Evening craft production in both civilizations involved activities that required artificial lighting but produced objects of remarkable beauty and cultural significance that served functional, artistic, and spiritual purposes within communities that valued skilled craftsmanship as essential for maintaining quality of life and cultural identity. Mexican metalworkers created jewelry and ceremonial objects using techniques that achieved effects modern technology struggles to replicate despite access to advanced tools and scientific understanding of metallurgy and materials science. The lost wax casting process used to create complex bronze and gold objects required understanding of metallurgy, artistic design, and ritual timing that coordinated technical processes with ceremonial requirements, creating objects that served not only practical and aesthetic functions but also spiritual purposes that connected human creativity to cosmic order. The knowledge required for these techniques was typically guarded as family secrets that were passed down through generations of specialized training and spiritual preparation. Greek evening craft activities included pottery painting, textile production, and metalwork that similarly combined technical skill with artistic vision and cultural knowledge, creating objects that served daily practical needs while communicating cultural values and aesthetic principles that enriched community life and maintained connections to traditional knowledge and skills. The geometric patterns that decorated pottery and textiles were not random designs but encoded information about family lineages, regional identities, and mythological references that could be read by educated observers as texts that preserved and transmitted cultural knowledge. The lighting used during these evening activities was itself a complex technology that required ongoing attention and skill to maintain, involving oil lamps that burned olive oil, animal fat, or plant-based fuels that had to be prepared, stored, and managed carefully to provide adequate illumination without creating fire hazards or excessive smoke that would make indoor activities impossible. Understanding proper lighting techniques was essential knowledge that affected safety, productivity, and comfort during evening hours when much important cultural and economic activity took place. The social dynamics of evening gatherings required understanding of hierarchy, etiquette, and cultural codes that governed interaction between people of different ages, genders, social classes, and regional origins according to complex systems that maintained community order while allowing for individual expression and cultural innovation. Learning to navigate these complex social waters required years of observation and practice, with mistakes potentially resulting in social ostracism, economic disadvantage, or worse consequences that could affect entire families and their descendants. The protocols governing appropriate behavior during evening gatherings included understanding of when to speak and when to remain silent, how to address people of different social ranks, what topics were appropriate for discussion in various contexts, and how to express disagreement or criticism without causing offense that could disrupt community harmony or damage important relationships. These social skills were considered essential education that began in early childhood and continued throughout life. As we contemplate these rich evening traditions from the warmth and comfort of our own fireside, we begin to understand how ancient peoples created meaning and beauty in their lives through practices that required dedication, skill, and community cooperation that modern individuals might find difficult to sustain given the competing demands of contemporary life and the individualistic values that often discourage the kind of long-term commitment and collective effort that these cultural traditions required for their maintenance and development. The activities we have been exploring were not simply ways to pass time or provide entertainment, but essential elements of cultural systems that maintained social cohesion, transmitted knowledge across generations, and created opportunities for artistic expression and spiritual development that enriched human experience in ways that modern technological entertainment often fails to provide despite its sophistication and accessibility. The gentle warmth radiating from our glowing coals provides a perfect accompaniment to imagining these ancient evening gatherings, where firelight similarly illuminated faces engaged in the serious play of cultural creation and community building that sustained civilizations across centuries of change and challenge, creating legacies of artistic achievement, intellectual inquiry, and spiritual wisdom that continue to inform and inspire contemporary efforts to create meaningful and sustainable communities. The fire has burned down to a bed of glowing coals that pulse with gentle warmth, creating the perfect atmosphere for deeper contemplation of the profound wisdom traditions that sustained ancient Mexican and Greek civilizations through centuries of change and challenge while providing frameworks for understanding human nature, cosmic order, and the relationship between individual consciousness and universal principles that continue to inform philosophical and spiritual inquiry across cultures and historical periods. As we settle more comfortably into our evening space, surrounded by the peaceful glow that connects us across time to countless generations who have similarly gathered around fires to contemplate life's deepest mysteries, we can begin to appreciate the sophisticated philosophical and spiritual systems that guided daily life in these remarkable cultures and provided meaning that transcended immediate practical concerns. The late evening hours in ancient Mexico were considered especially sacred, a time when the boundary between the material and spiritual worlds became more permeable and consciousness could more easily access realms of experience that remained hidden during the busy activities of daylight hours. Priests and trained practitioners would engage in contemplative practices that modern people might recognize as forms of meditation. Though organized around entirely different conceptual frameworks and intended to achieve specific types of spiritual knowledge and power that connected individual awareness to cosmic forces believed to govern weather, agriculture, health, and community prosperity. These contemplative practices were not casual relaxation techniques but sophisticated spiritual technologies that required years of training to perform safely and effectively, involving understanding of consciousness states, breath control, bodily postures, and mental techniques that could induce profound alterations in perception and awareness that provided access to information and experiences not available through ordinary sensory channels or rational analysis. The preparation required for these practices included dietary restrictions, physical conditioning, and mental training that developed the strength and stability necessary to navigate expanded states of consciousness without psychological damage or spiritual disorientation. The practitioners who guided these processes were trained specialists who understood both the techniques for inducing altered states and the methods for safely integrating the insights and experiences that emerged from these explorations. These contemplative practices often took place in specially designed architectural spaces that functioned as three-dimensional mandalas, with proportions, orientations, and decorative elements that were calculated to induce specific states of consciousness through environmental influences that affected perception, mood, and awareness in ways that modern environmental psychology is beginning to understand and appreciate. The mathematics underlying these constructions integrated astronomical observations, numerical symbolism, and acoustic properties in ways that created environments where spiritual practices could be pursued with maximum effectiveness while minimizing potential dangers that could arise from inappropriate settings or inadequate preparation. The knowledge required to design and construct these spaces represented sophisticated understanding of architecture, psychology, astronomy, and spiritual practice that was typically guarded as sacred knowledge passed down through generations of trained specialists. The breath control techniques used during Mexican spiritual practices were sophisticated systems for regulating consciousness and accessing non-ordinary states of awareness through precise manipulation of respiratory patterns that affected brain chemistry, nervous system function, and spiritual sensitivity in ways that modern scientific research is beginning to document and understand through studies of meditation and contemplative practice. These breathing methods were typically taught through apprenticeships that lasted for years and involved not only technical instruction but also moral preparation, spiritual guidance, and practical training that ensured students possessed the character and wisdom necessary to use these powerful techniques responsibly for the benefit of themselves and their communities rather than for personal aggrandizement or harmful purposes. The dietary restrictions and physical conditioning that accompanied this training were not arbitrary rules but practical requirements based on understanding of how nutrition, exercise, and lifestyle choices affected consciousness, spiritual sensitivity, and the ability to maintain stable awareness during intense spiritual practices that could be overwhelming or dangerous for unprepared individuals. The use of sacred plants in Mexican spiritual traditions was similarly complex, involving detailed knowledge of botanical properties, preparation methods, ritual timing, and integration practices that ensured the experiences contributed to spiritual development rather than mere recreational intoxication or psychological escapism. The practitioners who guided these experiences were trained healers and spiritual teachers who understood both the pharmacological and psychological aspects of consciousness-altering substances and possessed the wisdom and skill necessary to create safe and beneficial experiences for participants. These plant medicines were not used casually but were integral parts of elaborate ceremonial systems that included purification rituals, community support, spiritual guidance, and integration practices that helped participants understand and apply the insights gained during altered states of consciousness to their daily lives and spiritual development. The failure to approach these substances with appropriate respect and preparation could result in dangerous or traumatic experiences that could cause lasting psychological harm. Greek philosophical traditions developed different approaches to contemplative practice but demonstrated similar sophistication in their understanding of human consciousness and spiritual development, creating systems of mental training that combined intellectual analysis with practical exercises designed to cultivate wisdom, virtue, and inner peace that could withstand the challenges and uncertainties of human existence. The mystery schools of Eleusis, Delphi, and other sacred sites provided initiatory experiences that were said to fundamentally transform participants' understanding of reality and their place within cosmic order through direct encounters with divine realities that could not be adequately described in ordinary language or understood through purely rational analysis. These experiences were carefully orchestrated ceremonial events that combined dramatic presentations, architectural settings, and possibly consciousness-altering substances to create transformative encounters that influence participants for the rest of their lives. The preparation required for participation in these mystery traditions involved moral purification, intellectual study, and spiritual discipline that could take years to complete and were designed to ensure that candidates possessed the character and understanding necessary to benefit from and properly integrate the profound experiences that awaited them. The teachers and guides who facilitated these initiations were skilled practitioners who understood both the techniques for inducing mystical states and the psychology of spiritual transformation. The philosophical schools of Athens and other Greek cities developed systematic approaches to mental training that provided alternative paths to wisdom and spiritual development through disciplined intellectual inquiry combined with practical exercises designed to cultivate specific virtues and mental qualities that enabled individuals to live meaningful and effective lives regardless of external circumstances. The Stoic practices of evening reflection, morning preparation, and ongoing self-examination provided structured methods for applying philosophical insights to daily life situations, creating systematic approaches to personal development that could transform ordinary experiences into opportunities for moral and spiritual growth. These practices required understanding of human psychology, ethical principles, and practical wisdom that could be developed through study, reflection, and consistent application over many years. Pythagorean communities created comprehensive lifestyles that integrated mathematical study, musical practice, dietary regulations, and communal living in ways that were intended to harmonize individual development with cosmic principles and create social environments that supported both personal growth and collective well-being. Their understanding of numerical relationships in music, architecture, and natural phenomena provided frameworks for comprehending universal order that influenced Western thought for centuries and continues to inform contemporary scientific and philosophical inquiry. The mathematical investigations pursued by Pythagorean practitioners were not purely abstract intellectual exercises, but spiritual practices that revealed patterns and relationships believed to reflect fundamental principles governing reality at all levels from individual consciousness to cosmic order. The study of numerical ratios in musical harmony, geometric proportions in architecture, and mathematical relationships in natural phenomena provided methods for understanding universal principles that connected human experience to larger patterns of cosmic organization. The Platonic Academy developed contemplative practices that used mathematical reasoning, dialectical discussion, and mystical experience to guide students toward direct understanding of eternal truths that lay behind the changing phenomena of ordinary experience, creating educational systems that combined rigorous intellectual training with spiritual development in ways that prepared individuals for both practical leadership roles and ultimate philosophical understanding. These Platonic practices required years of preparation that included mathematical study, logical training, and moral development that purified consciousness and developed the mental clarity necessary for direct perception of eternal forms and principles that provided standards for evaluating and organizing temporal experience. The philosophical dialogues that emerged from these investigations created literary works that preserved and transmitted these teachings while demonstrating methods of inquiry that continue to influence educational and philosophical practice. The practices were considered dangerous for unprepared minds that might be overwhelmed by exposure to ultimate reality without adequate philosophical preparation and moral development. creating educational systems that carefully evaluated students' readiness for advanced teachings and provided gradual introduction to increasingly profound and demanding philosophical and spiritual investigations. Evening discussions in both Mexican and Greek traditions often focused on questions that modern people might consider abstract or impractical, but which were understood as essential for living meaningful and effective lives in communities that valued wisdom, virtue, and understanding of cosmic order as foundations for individual happiness and social harmony. The nature of justice, the relationship between individual and community, the structure of reality, and the proper approach to death were topics that required serious consideration by anyone hoping to achieve wisdom and fulfillment that could withstand the challenges and uncertainties of human existence. Mexican philosophical traditions were typically embedded in mythological narratives that used poetic imagery and symbolic language to convey insights about human nature and cosmic order that could not be adequately expressed through purely rational discourse or abstract analysis. The story cycles that were recited during evening gatherings contained multiple layers of meaning that could be interpreted differently depending on the listener's level of spiritual development and cultural knowledge, creating educational systems that could provide appropriate instruction for individuals at various stages of understanding while preserving profound teachings and forms that could be transmitted accurately across generations. These mythological narratives served multiple functions simultaneously, providing entertainment that made learning enjoyable, preserving historical information in memorable forms, transmitting moral teachings that guided behavior, and encoding spiritual knowledge that revealed deeper levels of meaning to initiates who possessed the keys for unlocking symbolic content. The storytellers who maintained these traditions were skilled interpreters who could adapt their presentations to different audiences while preserving essential teachings with accuracy that was crucial for cultural continuity. The concept of Teodol in Mexican philosophy represented an understanding of divine presence that pervaded all existence while remaining beyond human comprehension, creating philosophical frameworks that provided practical guidance for ethical behavior, spiritual practice, and artistic creation while acknowledging the fundamental mystery of existence that could never be completely understood through rational analysis alone. This understanding influenced approaches to religion, politics, art, and daily life that honored both human capabilities and cosmic mystery. Greek philosophical concepts like logos, nous, and Sophia represented similar attempts to understand the rational principles that governed cosmic order while recognizing the limitations of human knowledge and the importance of cultivating appropriate humility in the face of ultimate mystery that transcended finite understanding. These concepts provided frameworks for organizing intellectual investigation while maintaining appreciation for the transcendent dimensions of existence that could be approached through contemplative practice but never fully grasped through purely rational analysis. The development of these philosophical concepts required centuries of investigation by multiple generations of thinkers who built upon each other's insights while contributing original understanding that advanced human comprehension of fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, ethics, and spiritual development. The traditions that emerged from these investigations created intellectual legacies that continue to inform contemporary philosophy, science, and spiritual practice. The ethical systems developed by both civilizations addressed practical questions about how to live well in complex social environments while pursuing individual spiritual development that contributed to rather than conflicted with collective well-being. The Mexican concept of balance required understanding how personal actions affected community harmony and cosmic order, with elaborate systems of reciprocal obligation that ensured individual fulfillment supported rather than undermined the prosperity and stability of the larger social and natural systems within which human life was embedded. Greek virtue ethics similarly emphasized the development of character traits that enabled individuals to flourish while contributing effectively to community life, creating educational systems that cultivated courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom as practical training for navigating life's challenges while maintaining integrity and effectiveness in social roles and personal relationships that required both individual excellence and cooperative ability. The artistic traditions of both civilizations served not only aesthetic functions but also spiritual and philosophical purposes, with poetry, music, visual arts, and dramatic performance all understood as means of exploring and communicating insights about human nature and cosmic order that could not be adequately expressed through purely intellectual discourse or abstract analysis. These artistic practices created experiential knowledge that complemented and enriched rational understanding while providing accessible forms for transmitting complex teachings to diverse audiences. Mexican artistic traditions integrated complex symbolism, mathematical relationships, and spiritual technologies in ways that created objects of power that were believed to actively influence reality rather than merely representing it, demonstrating understanding of consciousness, energy, and material manifestation that modern physics and psychology are beginning to approach through quantum mechanics and consciousness research. The creation of these objects required understanding of artistic techniques, symbolic systems, and ritual practices that connected creative work to larger spiritual purposes and cosmic patterns, making artistic practice a form of spiritual discipline that could contribute to individual development and community well-being while preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge and spiritual wisdom. Greek artistic traditions similarly integrated technical skill with philosophical understanding and spiritual insight, creating works that were intended to educate emotions, refine aesthetic sensibility, and communicate truths about ideal forms of beauty, justice, and harmony that provided standards for organizing individual and community life according to principles that honored both human nature and cosmic order. As we continue our contemplation beside the gentle warmth of glowing coals that seem to pulse with the rhythm of ancient wisdom, we begin to appreciate how these wisdom traditions provided practical guidance for living meaningful lives while acknowledging the fundamental mysteries of existence that transcend human understanding but can be approached through disciplined practice and appropriate reverence. The late evening hours we are exploring were times when these deeper questions could be pursued with the focus and dedication they deserved, creating opportunities for spiritual development and philosophical understanding that enriched individual lives and strengthened community bonds. The peaceful atmosphere of our fireside space mirrors the contemplative environments that ancient peoples created for serious investigation of life's most important questions. Spaces where the distractions of daily survival gave way to the patient pursuit of wisdom that could sustain individuals and communities through whatever challenges they might face while providing meaning and purpose that transcended immediate circumstances and connected human experience to eternal principles and cosmic order. The coals in our fireplace have reached that perfect stage of deep, steady glow that seems to pulse with its own inner life, casting a gentle radiance that creates an atmosphere of profound peace and contemplation. This is the hour when ancient peoples often experienced their most transcendent moments, when the practical concerns of daily life receded and consciousness could expand into direct contact with the sacred dimensions of existence. In the late-night hours of ancient Mexico, the most dedicated spiritual practitioners would enter into states of consciousness that transcended ordinary awareness and provided access to knowledge and experience that could not be obtained through normal means. These practices often took place in underground chambers or specially constructed temple rooms where the architecture itself was designed to facilitate altered states of consciousness. The acoustic properties of these sacred spaces were calculated to amplify certain sound frequencies while filtering out others, creating sonic environments that could induce specific types of spiritual experience. The rhythmic beating of drums, the resonant tones of conch shells, and the harmonic chanting of trained voices combined to create sound landscapes that guided consciousness into non-ordinary states where communication with spiritual forces became possible. The visual elements of these sacred spaces were equally sophisticated, with carefully placed mirrors made from polished obsidian, wall paintings that used specific color combinations and geometric patterns, and architectural features that created optical effects designed to trigger neurological responses that facilitated mystical experience. The practitioners who used these spaces understood the relationship between sensory input and consciousness in ways that modern neuroscience is only beginning to appreciate. The breathing techniques employed during these sessions were complex systems that coordinated respiratory patterns with specific mental visualizations and bodily postures to achieve precise alterations in brain chemistry and electrical activity. These methods were typically taught through oral tradition by masters who had spent decades perfecting their understanding of consciousness and its modification through disciplined practice. Greek mystery traditions developed parallel approaches to transcendent experience, though organized around different cultural frameworks and employing different specific techniques. The initiation ceremonies at Eleusis were said to provide direct experience of death and rebirth that fundamentally transformed participants' understanding of life's meaning and their relationship to cosmic order. These Greek mystical experiences often involved carefully orchestrated dramatic presentations that combined theatrical elements with psychoactive substances, music, and architectural settings designed to overwhelm ordinary consciousness and precipitate encounters with divine realities that could not be adequately described in ordinary language. The philosophical preparation required for these experiences was extensive, involving years of study and mental training that developed the conceptual frameworks and emotional stability necessary to integrate transcendent experiences into daily life without psychological damage or spiritual inflation. The teachers who guided these processes were skilled psychologists who understood both the techniques for inducing mystical states and the methods for safely integrating their insights. The after effects of these transcendent experiences were understood to require ongoing support and guidance, with post-initiation training that helped participants translate mystical insights into practical wisdom that could enhance their effectiveness in ordinary social roles while maintaining connection to the sacred dimensions of existence they had directly encountered. Mexican spiritual traditions placed similar emphasis on integration, with elaborate systems of mentorship and community support that ensured transcendent experiences contributed to individual maturation and community welfare rather than leading to withdrawal from social responsibility or claims of special spiritual status that could disrupt social harmony. The artistic expressions that emerged from these transcendent experiences were understood as sacred technologies that could transmit spiritual insights to others who had not undergone similar direct experiences. Mexican codex paintings, Greek dramatic poetry, and the architectural designs of both civilizations served as vehicles for communicating mystical knowledge in forms that could be appreciated at multiple levels of understanding. These artistic traditions required training that integrated technical skill with spiritual development, ensuring that the creators of sacred art possessed both the ability to execute their visions with professional competence and the spiritual maturity to handle the powerful energies they were working with in their creative practice. The musical traditions associated with these transcendent practices were particularly sophisticated, involving scales, rhythms, and harmonic relationships that were calculated to induce specific states of consciousness and facilitate communication between ordinary and non-ordinary realities. The instruments used in these traditions were often consecrated objects that were believed to possess their own spiritual power and required special handling and maintenance. Mexican musical traditions included complex percussion instruments that could produce multiple tones and rhythmic patterns simultaneously, creating layered sonic environments that guided consciousness through specific sequences of spiritual states. The players of these instruments underwent years of training that combined musical technique with spiritual discipline and often involved dietary restrictions and behavioral codes that maintained their effectiveness as spiritual practitioners. Greek musical traditions similarly understood the relationship between specific musical structures and consciousness states, with elaborate theoretical systems that connected mathematical ratios in music to cosmic harmonies and psychological effects. The performance of sacred music was considered a form of spiritual practice that required both technical mastery and spiritual attunement. The community aspects of these transcendent experiences were equally important, with elaborate systems of mutual support and shared responsibility that ensured individual spiritual development contributed to collective wisdom and social cohesion. The practitioners who achieved advanced spiritual states were expected to use their insights for community service rather than personal aggrandizement. The teaching traditions that transmitted these practices across generations required master teachers who possessed not only technical knowledge of spiritual methods but also the wisdom to evaluate students' readiness for advanced practices and the skill to modify traditional methods to meet individual needs while maintaining the integrity of the spiritual traditions. As we sit in the gentle glow of our fireplace, contemplating these ancient approaches to transcendent experience, we can appreciate the sophistication and wisdom of traditions that understood consciousness as a vast territory to be explored with the same careful attention that we might give to geographical or scientific investigation. The peaceful atmosphere of our evening space provides a glimpse of the contemplative environments that these ancient practitioners created for their most profound spiritual work. Spaces where the ordinary concerns of daily life could be temporarily set aside to allow consciousness to expand into direct contact with the sacred dimensions of existence that sustained and guided their remarkable civilizations. The warmth radiating from our glowing coals reminds us of the fires that burned in ancient temples and ceremonial spaces, flames that were understood not merely as sources of light and heat, but as living symbols of the spiritual forces that animated all existence and could be contacted through disciplined practice and appropriate reverence. As the evening deepens and our fire settles into its final stages of gentle glowing, we find ourselves naturally drawn into that peaceful transition period when ancient peoples began their gradual preparation for sleep. The coals pulse with a soft, hypnotic rhythm that seems to slow time itself, creating an atmosphere perfectly suited for understanding how these remarkable civilizations approached the sacred transition from waking consciousness into the restorative mysteries of sleep. In ancient Mexico, the approach of deep night brought a shift in spiritual awareness that was recognized and honored through specific practices designed to ensure that sleep would be both physically restorative and spiritually beneficial. The transition from evening activities to nighttime rest was not simply a matter of physical exhaustion, but a conscious movement into different states of consciousness that were understood to serve essential functions for individual and community well-being. The preparation for sleep involved ritual cleansing practices that served both hygienic and spiritual purposes. The washing of hands, feet, and face with water that had been specially prepared during the day was understood to remove not only physical impurities but also the psychic residues of daily interactions that could interfere with peaceful rest and meaningful dreams. The arrangement of sleeping spaces reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between physical environment and sleep quality. Sleeping mats were positioned to align with specific cardinal directions that were believed to harmonize individual energy with cosmic forces, while the materials used in bedding were selected for their ability to promote restful sleep and protect against negative spiritual influences. The mental preparation for sleep involved contemplative practices that helped transition consciousness from the active engagement required for daily activities into the receptive state that allowed for restorative rest and meaningful dream experiences. These practices often included review of the day's events, gratitude for benefits received, and request for guidance and protection during the vulnerable hours of sleep. Greek approaches to sleep preparation were similarly sophisticated but reflected different cultural frameworks and spiritual understanding. The evening philosophical discussions that were so central to Greek social life often concluded with contemplative exercises designed to settle the mind and prepare consciousness for the transition into sleep and dream states. The physical preparation for sleep in Greek households involved attention to environmental factors that could affect sleep quality, including the arrangement of bedding, the management of temperature and air circulation, and the elimination of disturbances that could interrupt rest. The understanding of sleep as essential for physical health, mental clarity, and spiritual well-being led to careful attention to creating optimal conditions for restorative rest. The philosophical frameworks that Greeks used to understand sleep and dreams provided conceptual tools for interpreting nighttime experiences as sources of insight, guidance, and connection to divine realities that were not accessible during ordinary waking consciousness. The practice of dream incubation involved specific preparations and requests for meaningful dreams that could provide guidance for important decisions or insight into complex problems. The gradual reduction of activities during the transition towards sleep was understood in both civilizations as an important process that should not be rushed or abbreviated. The mind required time to process the experiences of the day, integrate new learning, and prepare for the different kind of consciousness that characterized sleep and dream states. Mexican evening practices included specific breathing exercises that were designed to slow heart rate, relax muscular tension, and induce the physiological changes that facilitated the transition into sleep. These techniques were often taught within family traditions and were understood to serve not only immediate practical purposes but also to train consciousness for more advanced spiritual practices. The use of aromatic plants and incenses during evening preparations served multiple functions, including the practical purpose of repelling insects and the spiritual purpose of creating atmospheric conditions that promoted peaceful rest and meaningful dreams. The selection and preparation of these aromatic materials required knowledge of botanical properties and seasonal availability that was typically maintained within specialized family or craft traditions. Greek evening practices similarly involved attention to environmental factors that could enhance sleep quality, including the use of specific oils and aromatics that were believed to promote restful sleep and pleasant dreams. The understanding of the relationship between scent and consciousness was sophisticated enough to support the development of specialized preparations for different types of sleep-related needs. The social aspects of sleep preparation were equally important in both civilizations, with family and community practices that ensured everyone had access to the support and protection needed for safe and restorative rest. The evening activities that brought people together also served to strengthen social bonds and create the sense of security that was essential for peaceful sleep in environments where physical safety could not be taken for granted. The storytelling traditions that often concluded evening gatherings served specific functions related to sleep preparation, providing mental content that could occupy consciousness during the transition into sleep while avoiding material that might cause anxiety or excitement that could interfere with rest. The selection of appropriate stories required understanding of psychological principles that ensured entertainment value did not compromise sleep quality. The spiritual understanding of sleep as a time when consciousness could access different realms of experience led to practices that were designed to enhance the meaningful content of dreams and facilitate communication with spiritual forces that could provide guidance and protection. These practices required understanding of consciousness states that went far beyond simple physical rest. The gradual reduction of light during evening hours was managed through careful attention to the timing and intensity of artificial illumination, with understanding that abrupt transitions from bright light to darkness could interfere with the natural physiological processes that prepared the body for sleep. The use of progressively dimmer lighting helped coordinate biological rhythms with environmental cycles. As we sit in the gentle glow of our fire, now reduced to softly pulsing coals that provide just enough light to maintain visual contact with our surroundings, we can appreciate the wisdom of ancient approaches to sleep preparation that recognize the transition into rest as a sacred process deserving careful attention and appropriate reverence. The peaceful atmosphere of our fireside space provides a perfect environment for understanding how ancient peoples created conditions that supported not only physical rest, but also the spiritual dimensions of sleep that were understood to be essential for complete human flourishing and community well-being. The warmth radiating from our dying fire creates that perfect temperature for contemplating the approach of sleep, neither too warm nor too cool, providing the kind of gentle comfort that facilitates the natural transition from waking consciousness into the restorative mysteries of peaceful rest. As our fire burns down to its final glowing embers, casting the softest possible light that barely illuminates the peaceful space around us, we enter into the most sacred and gentle portion of our journey through ancient civilizations. This is the hour when consciousness naturally begins its transition from the active engagement of waking life into the profound mysteries of sleep, a passage that ancient Mexican and Greek peoples understood as one of the most important and meaningful experiences of human existence. The final embers of our fire pulse with such gentle warmth that they seem to breathe with the rhythm of peaceful sleep itself, creating an atmosphere of perfect tranquility that mirrors the carefully prepared environments that ancient peoples created for their nightly transition into rest and dreams. The soft glow provides just enough light to maintain a sense of security while allowing consciousness to begin its natural movement toward the deep peace of restorative sleep. In ancient Mexico, the final preparations for sleep were understood as sacred rituals that honored the profound mystery of consciousness and its nightly journey into realms of experience that remained largely beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. The practitioners of spiritual traditions recognized sleep not simply as physical necessity, but as opportunity for the soul to travel beyond the limitations of material existence and access sources of wisdom and healing that were not available during waking hours. The breathing practices that accompanied the transition into sleep were designed to coordinate respiratory rhythms with the natural cycles of consciousness that characterize the approach of deep rest. These techniques involved gradually slowing and deepening the breath while maintaining attention to the subtle sensations and energy movements that accompanied the relaxation of muscular tension and the settling of mental activity. The visualization practices that were often used during this transition period involved gentle imagery drawn from the natural world, particularly focusing on elements that suggested peace, security, and connection to the larger rhythms of cosmic order. Images of calm water, steady earth, gentle breezes, and starlit skies provided mental content that supported the natural movement of consciousness towards sleep while avoiding stimulating or disturbing material that could interfere with rest. Greek approaches to the transition into sleep emphasized the philosophical and spiritual significance of this daily passage between different states of consciousness. The understanding of sleep as a form of temporary death that was followed by daily rebirth provided a framework for approaching rest with appropriate reverence and attention to its profound implications for human existence and spiritual development. The prayers and contemplative practices that concluded Greek evening routines often included expressions of gratitude for the day's experiences and requests for protection and guidance during the vulnerable hours of sleep. These practices served both psychological and spiritual functions, helping to settle unresolved concerns from the day while establishing appropriate relationship with divine forces that were understood to be particularly accessible during sleep and dream states. The physical settling that accompanied these evening practices involved progressive relaxation techniques that helped release the muscular tensions and mental preoccupations that could interfere with the natural transition into sleep. The understanding of the relationship between physical comfort and mental peace led to careful attention to body position, temperature regulation, and the elimination of environmental disturbances that could interrupt the delicate process of consciousness transition. The gradual reduction of mental activity during the approach of sleep was facilitated through contemplative practices that provided gentle focus for attention while avoiding engaging content that might stimulate active thinking or emotional responses. The repetition of familiar prayers, the visualization of peaceful imagery, or the simple observation of breathing patterns provided mental anchors that supported the natural movement toward unconsciousness. The understanding of dreams as meaningful communications from spiritual realms led to practices that were designed to enhance dream recall and facilitate the integration of nighttime experiences into waking life. The preparation for meaningful dreams often involved specific requests for guidance on particular questions or challenges, with the understanding that sleep consciousness could access wisdom and insight that was not available to ordinary waking awareness. The community aspects of sleep preparation included practices that ensured the safety and protection of sleeping individuals, with understanding that the unconscious state of sleep created vulnerability that required appropriate safeguards. The arrangement of sleeping spaces, the positioning of protective objects, and the maintenance of watch schedules all reflected sophisticated understanding of the practical and spiritual needs of sleeping communities. The seasonal and astronomical considerations that influenced sleep practices reflected the understanding that human consciousness was intimately connected to larger cosmic rhythms that affected the quality and meaning of rest and dreams. The timing of sleep, the duration of rest periods, and the specific practices used during different seasons all reflected attention to environmental factors that could enhance or interfere with restorative processes. As we sit in the gentle warmth radiating from the final glowing coals of our fire, we can feel our own consciousness beginning to settle into the peaceful rhythm that characterizes the approach of sleep. The soft light provides just enough illumination to maintain visual contact with our comfortable surroundings while allowing our attention to turn inward toward the subtle sensations and quiet thoughts that accompany the transition toward rest. The breathing naturally slows and deepens as we contemplate the wisdom of ancient approaches to sleep that recognize this daily transition as an opportunity for spiritual practice and personal transformation. The understanding that sleep was not simply absence of consciousness but rather access to different dimensions of awareness provided frameworks for approaching rest with reverence and attention that enhanced its restorative and illuminating potential. The peaceful atmosphere that surrounds us as we prepare for our own transition into sleep mirrors the carefully created environments that ancient peoples established for their nightly journey into the mysteries of unconscious experience. The gentle warmth, the soft light, the comfortable furnishings, and the quiet space all contribute to conditions that support natural sleep processes while honoring the sacred dimensions of rest and dreams. The final glowing embers of our fire seem to pulse with the gentle rhythm of peaceful breathing, providing a visual focus that supports the natural settling of consciousness as it prepares for the profound rest that will restore body, mind, and spirit for whatever challenges and opportunities await in the coming day. As consciousness naturally begins its transition toward the deep peace of restorative sleep, we can carry with us an appreciation for the wisdom and sophistication of ancient civilizations that understood rest not simply as physical necessity, but as sacred opportunity for healing, insight, and connection to the eternal mysteries that sustain all existence. The gentle warmth and soft light of our dying fire provide the perfect conditions for this transition, creating an atmosphere of perfect peace and security that supports the natural movement of consciousness toward the profound rest and meaningful dreams that await in the healing darkness of peaceful sleep. The ancient wisdom traditions we have explored tonight remind us that sleep is not merely the absence of waking consciousness, but rather a doorway into dimensions of experience that offer restoration, insight, and connection to sources of wisdom that transcend ordinary understanding, making each night's rest a sacred journey worthy of reverence and appropriate preparation. As the final embers fade into gentle darkness, consciousness naturally settles into the peaceful rhythm of deep, restorative sleep, carrying forward the wisdom and beauty of ancient civilizations into the timeless realm of dreams and healing rest that sustains all life and consciousness through the eternal cycles of day and night, waking and sleeping, activity and rest.